there is a real mental illness crisis in America right now. It didn't start yesterday. I understand that mass shooters have been around for a while, but there's some societal issues here that have to be addressed. It doesn't get fixed by blocking access to the schools, although that would have been better for those poor families that are suffering right now. And it doesn't really, it's not fixed by absolute banning of guns or assault rifles or any rifles. Would it help? Sure. But it's when we have a society where 18 to 24-year-old men are so hateful and glued to video screens and on, alternative websites and completely antisocial with family dysfunction. And, most of them leak their plans to their friends at some point, friends or family, almost 80% of the cases. So that's some really weird stuff.
Republicans Overseas Greg Swenson. Morning, Greg.
Good morning, Calum. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's good to speak to you. Should the NRA really be celebrating firearms this weekend, which is the tagline they're using for their gathering? Yeah,
I'm not sure that's particularly tasteful to do that, but I think the problem with big conventions or annual conventions is they're hard to change. Even after Columbine, this is going back 20 years, but even after the Columbine shooting, they continued with their show. I think they might have shortened it from 3 days to 2 or something like that. But I also think everyone's quick to blame the NRA. The NRA doesn't have nearly the power that it did a generation or two ago, Calum. So is it a lack of taste? Yeah, absolutely. But I'm not sure that it's up to the NRA to take responsibility for this absolute crazy person or mentally unstable person that committed this horrible act. So it's a tough one. Is it distasteful? Look, I'm from the Northeast and in the upper Midwest, so I didn't really grow up in a gun culture. So I don't really get the NRA. I don't really get gun conventions. I also don't understand a lot of other organizations that celebrate certain things that I just don't get a kick out of, whether it's a certain sport or a certain, hobby or something. So I don't understand the gun culture, from the NRA perspective, but I do understand the fundamental rights and Second Amendment rights, and that's something that is a very American, a part of the American culture as well.
Yeah, and we get that, and we understand it to an extent, in that it is baked into American culture, if you like. Should it be? Is it not time to grow up and to reconsider this, actually, that things move on and we don't need to celebrate firearms anymore?
That's a great question. I don't know that the country would tolerate any sort of dramatic change. I think everybody is rational enough to understand that, an 18-year-old male, especially male, because that's always who the mass shooters are. 18-year-old male probably shouldn't be able to buy with mental illness, should not be able to buy a rifle of any kind. Forget about assault weapons so yeah, I think there's some sensible reforms, but to change the view about the Second Amendment, I think that's a step too far. I just don't think that so many Americans will tolerate it. You'll notice that the criticism from the left is on is heaped on the NRA or the gun lobby, the so-called gun lobby, because they don't really want to offend the millions and millions of gun owners, many of whom are Democrats. Yeah. So I think they're very careful about that. So I think there's solutions. There's no easy solution because strict gun control hasn't worked in many respects in the big cities where guns are illegal and states. But also, I'm not suggesting it wouldn't have an effect at all. Sure. Don't get me wrong, but it's not the only problem. I think there's the shooter, there's the weapon, and there's the targets. And I think, focusing too much on the weapons isn't going to solve the other two problems.
I understand. I do just wonder then, with that in mind, if the Second Amendment is here to stay as it has been for, centuries now, why don't we consider what one reporter in the area was telling us yesterday, earlier on the programme, that actually the school in question here this week had implemented the measures that had been recommended and in some cases legislated. And clearly that did not make any difference in keeping 21 people, including 19 children, safe. So, if the Second Amendment is here to stay, and there is you're advocating the idea of perhaps some more restrictions, some more controls in some ways. Actually, they're not going anywhere near far enough. America's not learned its lesson in decades of these incidents.
That's a good point. And I think perhaps some of the policies that have been designed about protecting schools were not properly implemented. It sounds like there
in
were
this
some
school they
mistakes.
were. That's what that reporter was
Yeah, well,
saying. That's the
I'm
point.
not sure about that. I mean, there were some unlocked doors. There were definitely a lack of movement by security outside the school. So I think there's some improvements. And I'm sorry if I don't, know the absolute detail
Sure.
yet, because it's. I think we'll learn a lot more in the next few days. But I think there's a lot of improvements. And I mentioned the three issues. That's focusing on the targets, the children, protecting them. We're sending $53 billion to Ukraine. That kind of money would pay for 2 SWAT officers at every school in America for the year. So there's I think some more that can be done. Again, I don't think it solves the entire problem, but I think there's more that can be done around protecting the schools with guards, or whether it's retired police or retired military, or even current police.
Do you not accept, Greg?
Police are spread very thin,
yeah.
so I have to be careful with that, because
Sure.
the defund the police movement has really set back the great men and women who serve in the police force. So
yeah, I hear
they're
you,
stretched.
and I apologise if I sound, and I apologise for interrupting, and I apologise
No,
for
that's
sounding
all right.
frustrated. But is there no part of you that stops to hesitate the need to advocate for guards at a school? Does that not even make you question anything?
Of course, it's absolutely depressing. I mean, this is a horrible moment. The fact that I have to talk rationally about guards at schools, and my children went through the school system in America, mostly in Catholic schools. But when my daughter did go to public school or state school for a short time, it felt like lockdown at the schools, because the parents couldn't come in because they were so restricted on who could enter the building. And perhaps that was good for safety, but it didn't really make for a real family culture that we experienced in the Catholic schools. But yeah, Calum, it pains me that we even have to have this conversation.
Yeah.
But there is a real mental illness crisis in America right now. It didn't start yesterday. I understand that mass shooters have been around for a while. But there's some societal issues here that have to be addressed. It doesn't get fixed by blocking access to the schools, although that would have been better for those poor families that are suffering right now. And it's not fixed by absolute banning of guns or assault rifles or any rifles. Would it help? Sure. But it's when we have a society where 18 to 24-year-old men are so hateful and glued to video screens and on alternative websites, and completely antisocial, with family dysfunction, and most of them leak their plans to their friends at some point, friends to family, almost 80% of the cases. So that's some really weird stuff, and there's a lot of underlying issues that we have to deal with. So I don't want for a minute to think that it's casual for me to banter about guards in schools or about assault rifles. It's crazy that we have to actually have those conversations, or that someone that can be sick enough and wasn't picked up. Someone didn't notice how this sick person wasn't dealt with, wasn't institutionalized. And that's what happened in Lakeland, Florida, where those signals were clearly missed. And that's a mental health crisis, and that's another story to discuss.
Indeed. Greg, thank you so much. Thanks for your input on this. Greg Swenson, there, chairman of Republicans Overseas.